Hello everyone, and welcome to my new Deltarune theory, Nightmare Theory. Today I will be talking about exactly what these two gremlins, Friend and, well, people call them ERAM, are, and why knowing what they are is painfully significant to the entirety of Deltarune. So, before we start dilly-dallying, let's begin. So, there's a lot of confusion about what even this weird demon nightmare thing even is. I mean, we don't even have it directly confirmed what its name is. So, before we, get into that, let's review a few basics about what this ERAM thing is. So, we know that one, it resides within the shelter, because we see it in the Mantle game. It seems to intimately know Kris. It's like, hey, I know, human, I remember your Snowgraves, even though Kris did the Snowgrave route like 2 hours ago. And, well, we did the Snowgrave route. And upon defeat, it gives us the Shadow Mantle. It also seems very different from any Darkner we've seen so far, just in terms of, like, vibes and appearance. And before, a lot of people think that this guy is the Shadow Mantle, which, no. it, it drops the Shadow Mantle. It is holding the Shadow Mantle. It reiterates, like, 20 times. It's like, you want this mantle that I'm holding. You want this mantle that I have. It's like, it very clearly differentiates itself from the Shadow Mantle, and then it says, we both have work to do before going on its own way, and then putting the Shadow Mantle off, like it's about to do its own thing, which wouldn't really make sense if it was the Shadow Mantle and was just going to be an equipped item the entire rest of the time. I do see where it's coming from, though. This thing kind of does look like it could be a Shadow Mantle, but a Shadow Mantle wouldn't have a face on it. So, what type of Darkner even is this ERAM thing? So, visually, it looks like the Shadow Mantle, as I just said. It's pure black with an orange mouth, the only hint of color on it. Of course, this image I found has a white outline, but that's not in the game. All but 5 Darkners are pure dark, or basically pure dark, like ERAM is. And when I made this slideshow, there's actually 6, because the ballerinas in Castletown, or in the Chapter 1 Scarlet Forest Dark World, I guess you could kind of say are like that, but they don't do anything. They have no dialogue. They don't tell us anything about it, so I'm just going to say 5. So, 4 Darkners that match this description are the Titan, the Titan Spawn, the Knight, and the Shadow Guys, which is very off, but I think I kind of have a theory about that. So, before we go into my big theory, I think I need to put down a few things about the kind of debated cosmology of Deltarune, starting with the importance of darkness. So, darkness, of course, is, the stuff that flows in the dark fountains. It makes the dark worlds and whatever. But the fountains, of course, have to leak darkness from somewhere. They're a fountain. They take, liquid or flow from someplace, and darkness is compared to water multiple times. So it takes, let's say, dark water from some ocean, maybe, and it puts it up into the dark world. And that ocean of darkness is what we call the depths. Now, the depths is kind of debated on if it exists or not in the Chapter 3 and 4 era, but I think the existence of the Titans really reinforces that it does, even if there seems to be a more shift or just dark worlds being darker yet darker and not the depths. So, the depths are referred to by Jevil as literally hell. He's like, hell's roar bubbles from the depths. They're the opposite of the angel's heaven, which of course is the realm above the light world. Also, the Goner Maker image is called Image Depth, so that's why it's down here. I think this is where the Titans are from. You have too much darkness flowing from the depths, the Titans come up from the darkness, and this is also where Gaster probably is. Speaking of the Titans, the Shadow of the Mind. So, of the 5 darker yet darker Darkners, the Titan is the one that we know most about, which is really saying something, because we don't know much about it. But basically, the Titans are the shadow of the backside of your mind, as Ralsei put it. Said, they are fear itself. They're destruction incarnate. They're pure darkness, and they are always there in some form because they are part of your mind. That's why they've always been there. They've just been lurking. And what that means is that the dark worlds are basically reflections of your mind and interpretations where everything you imagine becomes reality. And when it gets too dark in a dark world, anything you imagine is real. And the Titans are the fear in your imagination. They aren't based off reality like regular Darkners because there's no light. You can't see anything, so anything you imagine becomes reality. And there's this idea of fear of the darkness, so obviously if you're in a place of deep darkness, the Titans are going to appear. And that's why in the darker areas of Chapter 4, the Titan spawn appear, because you're in a place of such deep darkness where your fear becomes incarnate as these Titan spawn. But we've kind of been going off track from ERAM, so what is this thing? Well, if pure dark colorless Titans, and I know I said colorless, they have some like light here, but it's just monochrome. Not like grayscale monochrome, so not really copies are monochrome, but like, you know, black and white, no color. But they are the shadows of the mind, their fear, their darkness, their destruction, their mindless beast, which is kind of an idea in this collective subconscious, or what everybody imagines as, you know, the shadow of the backside of your mind. They are what everybody sees, right? Whereas ERAM and maybe Friend, with its splash of, you know, orange of color, represents the individual shadow of the mind, whereas the Titan, you know, represents the collective shadow. So it is personal traumas, insecurities, and self-loathing, things like that, right? Guilt, shame. And that makes ERAM your best nightmare. So ERAM is the personal shadow of the backside of Kris's mind. I feel like that's kind of obvious. They're Kris's nightmare. They represent all of Kris's self-loathing. They're the shame, they're the guilt. That's why they know everything about Kris, because they're always there. They are part of Kris's mind, just projected outwards. If the Chapter 3 Dark World is like Kris's own dream, then ERAM is there suppressed and hidden in the background. They're Kris's nightmare, and that's why they only show up in Chapter 3, because it's Kris's fountain. And so this brings me to my next point. What is this demon thing really called? Because I've been calling it ERAM this entire time. People have called it John Mantle, ERAM, or whatever. But its name isn't really agreed on by the fan base because it never says its name, like, ever. So, I mean, the only reason we call it ERAM is because the song that plays right before fighting it is called ERAM. But his real name, or at least the name that is used in the files, is Nightmare. And ERAM backward is mare, like a horse, I guess. But it's fitting, right? It's a nightmare, it's Kris's nightmare, it makes sense. That is what this thing is called, and from here on out, I will be calling this thing Nightmare. I swear this makes so much sense, right? Because Nightmare knows Kris's deeply repressed shame and guilt of hurting someone in the past, which is, you know, somewhat implied in the egg rooms. It's like they're egging on for Kris to be more violent. That Kris is like dark reflection. They're the dark self of Kris. And it resides in the shelter, which we know is a place of such deep trauma for Kris that they try to resist going into it, even in the dark world under our control, where we know our control is the most powerful. They say, well, we're able to do so much more in the dark world than we can in the light world with Kris, so Kris resisting us there is a big feat, and it shows just how much they really don't like this shelter. There's also that dialogue with Monster Kid and what's his name, Snowy, that also reinforces this idea. It's the perfect tormentor. It knows Kris's past sins. It's lost to time. You know, things that they've forgotten, that they want to forget, that they want to repress, that's deep down in Kris's mind that only they would know. But it brings it back up. It brings it back up to torment Kris, to remind Kris of everything that they hate themselves for, everything wrong that they've been doing. It even knows, you know, only hours after the weird route, like I mentioned earlier, that we did the weird route, because it is part of Kris's mind. It knows everything that Kris has done every single time, the second Kris does it. And it knows it enough, it's part of Kris's mind enough, that it can bring up even a small intrusive thought that Kris probably never even had, really, not like genuinely, like sure they thought about it, but they were like, no, that's wrong, right? Because we see in the chapter 4 weirder, Kris is like, really, really mad. They take us out and beat us up in a trash can, even though it hurts themselves because we're their soul, and it puts them on like half HP after that. We know that Kris doesn't like the Weird Out, but Nightmare is like, I know that you like doing that, and it's able to torment Kris about that because they have such high amounts of guilt. And it knows Kris so intimately, and Nightmare basically is Kris, and that makes it the perfect tormentor because who could hurt you more than yourself? So, I think a big question when we get to this is like, okay, ERAM knows everything about Kris. Can ERAM tell us anything about Kris? We know everything that it says is related to Kris' past, its thoughts, its shames. So what does it say? It says that Kris is playing, they want to find the shadow crystals. They say, without play, the knife grows dull, which is, a big line that they have, which a lot of people don't know what that means, and that is fair. ERAM, a lot of his dialogue does just seem like cryptic bullcrap the first time you read through it, which it kind of is. And it also says in this very, foreshadowy tone right before the fight starts, I can see in the dark, The question is, can you? And then it, does a maniacal laugh and whatever. Which, the way this is positioned, it feels like one of these tricky Tony lines that we're gonna look back at chapter 8 and be like, oh my god, he was foreshadowing it, insanely well, right? Ooh, 1225. my recording just got to 1225. Long. But it feels like one of these lines that we're gonna look back way later and be like, oh my god, Tricky Tony was cooking. Crystal, metal, freedom, you want it? It's yours, my friend, as long as you have enough rupees. I forgot this was the slide. Yeah, but the Shadow Crystal mention is pretty simple. Kris does themselves want to find the crystals, probably to break fate, because we see in the Weird Route, or not in the Weird Route, just if you have a Shadow Crystal and you go to any of the prophecy panels in chapter 4, they'll hold up the crystal and they won't see that the prophecy distorts and try and shake it. It's like, please let the prophecy change. They want the crystals to change the prophecy, and that's their only means of freedom in the story, which is kind of ironic because they have to rely on us to do it. It's their only agency away from whatever we're doing or the Night Gang's doing to get the crystals, even if it is by us, because they also want to do it, and they're putting a lot of effort to do it because they're the one fighting. Without play, the knife grows dull. So this is a real iconic ERAM line, but this line basically further reinforces that Kris, long ago, had a violent accident where they either hurt or killed someone in the past. ERAM, however, really seems to want Kris to continue to be violent. The entire fight seems to be about getting Kris's repressed violent side out. ERAM isn't even oh no, you hurt me too much. They're there it is, flickering red like pretty little flames. And it's a side that Kris probably longs to forget, but never can, especially because now in the Dark Worlds they have to do all this fighting. The question is, can you? So this was actually a clever reference by me. I made the slide way darker so that you couldn't see in the dark. I'm brilliant. 2000 IQ play. So as I was saying earlier, the delivery of this line, it just really seemed like they're setting up some insane foreshadowing, or maybe even pre-shadowing, it's referencing something that happened way long ago in Kris's past, and we're gonna look back at this in chapter 58,000, and we're gonna be like, oh, that's what this meant. Yeah, it's probably foreshadowing a particularly bad thing that happened in Kris's past, maybe an event in the shelter. So, I think we have enough here to try and start to piece together exactly what happened to Kris. So, we know, 1, Kris has had a traumatic experience with the bunker. That was already kind of obvious. But we also know that Kris tried to forget something, to repress, the Forgotten Man, which, not related to Nightmare really, but that is something that they were trying to repress. They're trying to forget the Forgotten Man. That's why he's forgotten. And there's also something to do with copies are monochrome, but it can be colored in with care, because we know the egg rooms are related to Kris' past, and we know that copies are monochrome and can be colored in with care is in the egg room. So, by a roundabout way, that line, relevant to Kris. And we know that Kris has had a violent incident in their past that they really struggle or try to suppress. I think all of this leads me to one big conclusion. I think Kris is a vessel that has broken free from the shelter. I think that Kris's big relation to the shelter, they hate it, they don't want to go near it, would make a lot of sense if this was a vessel who wants to forget that they are one, because, you know, you would want to forget if you're this weird monster creature and you're just trying to live a normal life, and every time you remember that, it, like, brings back all these bad memories of whatever traumatic incident happened there. And it also explains all these between your fingers of faint gray crease glitters stubbornly. You can never wash it all away, because Kris can never wash away the fact that they truly are, in reality, a vessel, not a human. Not a human, and absolutely not a monster like everybody else in town. But there is the second half of that line. Copies are monochrome, but can be colored in with care. Kris was a failed vessel who long ago escaped the shelter and was found by Asriel, probably, and taken into the Dreamer house, and it was Asriel's love who originally colored in Kris. And this ties in a lot to what we already know about Kris, right? Kris's love for Asriel is rooted in the fact that it was Asriel who found them. It was Asriel's love who colored in Kris. To Kris, they must have seemed like a real monster, not like an Undertale type just race monster, but like a genuine terrible monster, like a demon of sorts. And it was Asriel's acceptance of Kris's bizarre, unique, supernatural nature that led Kris to become somewhat accepted in society as not a horrid abomination thing. But of course, Kris wasn't satisfied with being the only human in a town of monsters. They wanted to fit in, they wanted to really forget what they were originally designed to be. And they were never really human, they were just a weird imitation of it. And this is why Kris wore the horned headband, this is why Kris was so insecure about what they were. It's because they were always this weird monster thing, and they longed to forget it. There's also, like, all these Undertale parallels that you can draw here, right? Because Kris, in this case, would be, you know, the member of this weird race from underground being taken in by Asriel Dreamer from above ground and brought into the Dreamer house, while basically being Kara, right? They like knives, like chocolate. It'd be like a weird, like, underswap AU style, like, Kara and Asriel type thing, right? It's like, is Undertale, but also it's like inverted Undertale. You get what I'm going for here, right? I also think that the Forgotten Man is probably a gun or two. I think it just, like, really really completes the whole deal with Kris being a vessel. It's like, okay, then why is the Forgotten Man forgotten? Because he's a vessel too. The Forgotten Man is, you know, related to copies are monochrome too. They have to be a Lightner because, you know, they show up occasionally in the library and in the car. But they also have to have teleportation to show up in every single Dark World. They're very Gaster coded too. They show up in random rooms in between and whatever. And they're in between while Gaster is green. Well, maybe that's not true, because this picture I have over here shows the Forgotten Man's tree being green, so maybe they're both green and in between. I feel like this explains everything, though, right? Because the Gunners can teleport, as we can see, so clearly he could easily show up in the Dark Worlds, maybe even out of bound. He's just described as a man, and a vessel, yeah, sure, they look vaguely human-like, but how can you even describe that? I mean, it's a man, I guess. There's such a big emphasis on the word man being here. It would be like a 5 billion IQ play from Toby Fox if this was it. Not to say that you couldn't make a compelling story or that this has to mean something, I just feel like I'd be kind of surprised if it wasn't, right? Toby J, there are no coincidences, Fox, after all. And also, the Forgotten Man usually can't talk, right? But he can in one area. And the vessels, they usually don't have a mouth, do they? That is a bit of a stretch, of course. The question would then be like, how did Kris get a mouth? Maybe the mouths were removed because it gave them too much personality. But another point is that, Forgotten Man's so gastery, all the vessels and goners are all very gastery too, because Gaster, made them. And there's also this line about how when Kris tries to draw what they saw behind the tree, they kind of panic, right? They scribble it out, and in the end, they leave nothing but a monochrome smear, because the thing that they saw behind the tree was only monochrome, and they were a goner, right? And they can never wash it all away, because like I said earlier, they'd like to think deep down, they'd like to be like, oh no, that's just pencil lead that got on my finger, but deep down inside themselves, they know that they're not fully 100% loved, and so there is a part of them, a small part of them, that is still not colored in with care. And there's this line, right? Eram says, flickering red, like pretty little flames, because Kris, of course, had this, experience in the past where they were violent, and I believe that I know, finally, because this has been like a big thing that I've been wondering for the longest time, who on earth did Kris, attack? I think it has to be the Forgotten Man, right? Because, Kris was so desperate to forget everything, right? That's the thing that we've been seeing bring back up and back up, is that Kris is desperate to forget what they were. And every time they saw the Forgotten Man, who probably did escape with them, they remembered. And they wanted to not remember. They didn't want to see this thing, this reminder of what they were. They didn't want to have to look in the mirror every time that they looked across the street. And so, Kris, panicked, anxious, impulsive, and young, attacked the Forgotten Man. It might have even been in their nature to be violent, depending on what type of vessel they were. And Nightmare even points this out, and that's who and why Kris attacked, which brings me a lot of closure, because this is something I've been really, scratching my head about since chapters 3 and 4 came out. If copies are monochrome, implying that a vessel is a copy, then who is Kris a copy of? Well, I think it's possible that Kris is just a vessel, based on a vessel that's just copying a basic human. I wouldn't really doubt it, I wouldn't be surprised, but if goners are usually copies of specific monsters, maybe a vessel is a copy of a human. If Kris is a copy of any human, I think, to nobody's surprise, they're probably Kara. They dress similarly. I mean, the important person shirt, which I'm wearing right now while I'm recording this, is listed both for Kris and for Kara, because it's like the same thing, right? They have similar likes. They both have red eyes. They both like chocolate and knives. Even if knives isn't, or chocolate isn't Kris's favorite food, it's still up there, right? But they still have different personalities and personhoods and backstories and look kind of different because they are generally different people, right? And that's why Kara's favorite thing was chocolate, and Kris really likes chocolate, but they also like pie better, right? Because they were adopted by the Dreamers a bit earlier. So, how was ERAM even formed, right? We've kind of tied all this back around to what Kris is doing and everything, but let's go back a bit to ERAM, or Nightmare, I'm sorry. So, your personal shadow, I think, that's what I'm going to call these things. I'm going to call them demons or nightmares or whatever. But for now, your personal shadow, the backside of your mind, can form and manifest into being as soon as you first enter the dark world. And then it manifests, and then it becomes real, and then it can act on itself. It can do whatever it wants. I don't have any specific proof for this. I feel like the rest of this theory, I have good, evidence for the mechanics of everything. How exactly they're formed, I'm just kind of wing-dinging it. But I think this would make a bit of sense. And so, Kris was in the shelter before, so their nightmare was always there. It always existed and had to grow stronger and stronger as Kris had more guilt, trauma, and shame, right? So it was always there, lurking in the background, lurking in the bunker, growing stronger as Kris became older and more shameful and more traumatized. Poor Kris, dude. Lost where the forest would grow. So, this is a bit of a theory, but long ago, when Kris, Noelle, Des, and Asriel followed the pointed tail, as it said, lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail into the shelter where Wingding's Gaster resides. Trust me, that was the intended line of dialogue. Toby Fox is my uncle. When they went to the bunker, it was only Kris and Des who went inside. And maybe it was Noelle, but if it was Noelle, it would have been, like, very short, maybe Asriel too, but they were probably, like, standing at the side. In any case, it doesn't really matter. It was only Kris and Des who went inside. And either because, Des would have just went because she's Des and she's badass and she feels like it. And Kris either because of peer pressure or I think compellingly. More compellingly, Kris went inside to follow Des because they were the only one who knew what was in there. They wanted to face their fears. They wanted to be able to protect Des. So they followed Kris, or Kris followed Des inside. And then, I believe, this is when Nightmare showed up and ruined everything. ERAM Nightmare. And then Nightmare, when Kris saw that, it reminded Kris of all their misdeeds and shame, and Nightmare kind of berated Kris, right? And they reminded them of their true nature and their trauma and everything that led them to flee the shelter in the first place. And they spun it in a way that made Kris terrified. And so Kris fled, leaving Des to fall into a darker yet darker world and become the Knight. No. I'm just kidding, guys. Did you really think I was a Des Knight or no? I'm all in on Papyrus Knight. Trust. No, but then Des became the Knight. And this is where the whole Night Gang's plan shows up, right? Because after Des becomes the Knight, Kris feels as if they were the one responsible for it. And if Kris truly were a vessel, wouldn't it make so much sense for them to be the one to handle the soul, the player, because they were the one mandated to take it in the first place. So they would be the only one who would be able to actually fulfill this plan safely. And so, it was their fault after all. It was them who wanted to protect Des and failed to protect Des. So shouldn't they be the one to take the biggest risk? Right? And so, the cage with human soul and parts, it really is an accurate description for the first hero, because I made the point in the past that it's like, hey, maybe the first hero is just a vessel and not Kris because of this description, but maybe it's because Kris is a vessel. And there's also this rudin, I feel like, and I think this might be the biggest discovery of all, why Kris is blue. So, remember that rudin that everybody was kinda like, I don't know what this guy's deal is, but he gives me schizophrenia in Chapter 2 when he was like, welcome to player name down. Or at least that's what I've heard it's called. So, he originally was green, but in Chapter 4 he turns blue. And he says that his color is faded, and he says to pay it no mind. Maybe Kris being blue in the dark world is also because their color is fading, right? They're going back to monochrome. And I think for that is enough for Nightmare, or ERAM, whatever. And now let's go on to the 5th Darkner. Of course, I said there were 5 in the slide, well, I said there were 6, but I only mentioned 5. So I guess this slide is wrong, it's the 6th Darkner, but whatever. So Friend is just like ERAM, really. They're pure black, they're hidden far away from the story, they only appear in the shadows, and he even shows up in the Nightmare fight, which if that isn't like a big connection between them, I don't know what is. So he has a large permanent grin on his face, and the only color is his eyes, pink and yellow. Just like ERAM only having color in his face. So Friend 2 is another demon. So who's demon this time, right? Well, I think the only choice really is Noelle. Noelle sees Friend in Cat Pedders the game. She sees him in Bat-At, specifically. He also sees him in that weird cave minigame that she was talking about. Friend appears a lot to Noelle, and probably only Noelle. Noelle also probably presumably encounters Friend or a manifestation of it with the egg, who, according to Spanton, is another man's treasure that appears in cat pedders that left home due to happiness, and Friend, if you will recall, has a big, giant, permanent smile on its face. So then, if we've established earlier that they only come into being from the Dark World, how is Friend made, right? So Friend must have existed before Dessa's disappearance, right? Because lost where the forest would grow, the children followed the pointed tail, and, the pointed tail must have existed for the children to have followed it. So, and I would like to be like, oh, Noelle entered the shelter Dark World, and that's how Friend formed. No, right? It already existed. So either the demons, I was wrong, and they don't actually need to enter a Dark World to spawn, or Noelle has been in a Dark World before the shelter one, which is possible. There's all these different prior Dark World theories. There's also the fact that Noelle likes to blink out weird memories and thinks that the first Dark World is just a dream. So it is possible that she hasn't, or that she has actually been to a Dark World before and just doesn't remember it. So here is my big theory claim. So, after coming into being, I believe that Friend went through the Dark World and through the depths and saw and met Gaster, becoming his friend. See what I did there? His tool to help Gaster manage the device. And this is like a bit irrelevant, shall we say. But in Chapter 3, Smile, the item that you can buy at one of the vending machines for like 1 point, maybe 10 points, is described as always at your humble service. And then when you buy it, it just says it smiled, which I feel like everybody has connected to Friend by this point. Oh my gosh. Yes, Gaster is green and in between. Right, thank you, 6-7 theory. So, my evidence for this claim is the smile item, which I just said was irrelevant because I'm a dirty liar. And the smile item is very heavily associated with Friend. As I said, its descriptor, always at your humble service, though, is very, very interesting, and it's mentioned elsewhere too. It's mentioned in these unused demon strings from Undertale, which have been very conspicuous, and there, and people have really thought about them, but haven't been able to draw any strong conclusions. There was a big section on them in the Delta cast, and in the end, they didn't really figure out anything. They were just like, yeah, this exists. And it goes, greetings, you have made yourself completely clear. I, your humble servant, will follow you to the utmost. And so, the reason that this supports the idea that Friend is Gaster's tool and met Gaster is that the character most associated with demons, besides Kara, the demon that sums when he calls its name, is Gaster, because of his demon motif via 666 being, Satan's motif, and that also being demons, right? So Gaster, I believe, is the one being addressed here, and because Friend is associated with always at your humble service, and the line from this must also mean that Friend is the speaker. They can talk because ERAM talks too, so this might be our only line of dialogue that we have from Friend. Also, Friend, always at your service? Come on, it lines up so perfectly. That's why he's named Friend, because he's device Friend. He is the device that Gaster used to mandate everything, that Gaster used to mandate the big overall Deltarune device, and he is a friend. Gaster works with Friend before. I swear, this has to be it. The device. Okay, so Gaster uses Friend to spy on us, to watch the device, to manipulate the light world and the dark world of Deltarune, because Gaster can't directly interfere with the story. After all, he's whatever Gaster's doing, he just can't interact with the story source. Trust me, bro. Maybe lost deep in the depths and he can't get out or whatever. But in any case, we know that Gaster uses Friend to manipulate the story, to enact his will on it, to change things, right? So we don't actually know to what ends Gaster is using Friend, because we don't know what ends Gaster wants anything. But I think it is possible that because we know what Friend did, we know that it was the pointed tail, and maybe drove the secret bosses insane, that was all Gaster's doing. Maybe to fulfill the prophecy, maybe to break it, because maybe, like, the tale that must not be followed. Maybe Gaster was wanting to break the prophecy, but also, like, they'll see the tale of hell take fall. Maybe that was part of the prophecy. Even if Gaster wrote the prophecy, which I strongly believe, he might still want it to be broken just to see what can happen. So I'm not really sure. But Friend's Gaster's thing now. And that kind of explains why, both Nightmare and Friend are kind of filling the role of Gaster, because they are very much being used by Gaster to do Gaster's bidding. And a thing that I mentioned last slide that I really kind of want to look into, did Friend really drive the secret bosses insane? And I think this really comes down to 2 points. One, there is a chance that it was Mike who drove both the secret bosses insane, and we can kind of round about that to Mike might be Friend. And if Gaster wanted the secret bosses to be like this, like they have all these Gaster motifs in them, and he can't act on it on his own, he may have used Friend, which is, 2 theories kind of wrapped into one, so both of these points are kind of like 4 theories that come together to make one theory, but that's just how Deltarune theorizing goes, I guess. So, I think the easiest area to find Mike driving the secret bosses insane and Mike being Friend is Spamton, right? So, Spamton's an easy connection. He talks with Mike like a friend, a partner. He says, "Please, Mike, answer the phone," in the lyrics, right? And he wears pink and yellow, just like Friend is pink and yellow. And Friend's, and Spamton's a notorious copycat, and Friend appears in Spamton's basement, so maybe Friend really did drive Spamton insane. Maybe Friend was Mike because, please, Mike, answer the phone, because Spamton wants Mike to answer the phone, and Mike is his mysterious benefactor. It all works back around. The harder connection to do is, did Mike or Friend or whoever pay Jevil a visit? Jevil has less connections with the color of Friend, right? He only has the 2 yellow eyes. His color palette, I think I've seen it been made case before that if you invert it, that's pink and yellow, but I feel like that's kind of a stretch. It could be theory though, but I just wouldn't be too confident to base anything off of it. He talks a lot about the night. He's like, in the shadow of the night's hand, King is like, yo, it was Jevil who told me of the night's brilliance, and the night is the one that drops the shadow crystals, so why don't we just say that the night is the one who paid Jevil a visit? The only problem with that is that, assumedly, the night doesn't talk. We've never seen them talk, we've only seen them laugh, and I feel like it would be kind of a weird thing if the night can talk. They're like this weird mindless-ish beast. And Jevil talks about a bunch of Gastery stuff. Sham's like, he said stuff that didn't make sense, but didn't quite not make sense either. And since then, my view of this world has gotten darker yet darker. The shadow's getting deeper, photon readings negative. I'm talking about Gaster. Direct quote from Sham, by the way. Look it up. If you don't remember it, your memory's just faulty. But yeah, this is all Gastery stuff, which we've established connects it to Friend, right? So this is maybe our biggest piece of evidence for Mike paying Jevil a visit. Our next thing, too, is Friend Mike? Because all of these have kind of been under the assumption that Friend is Mike. We've been like, okay, it kind of would make sense for Mike to do this, it would kind of make sense for Friend to do this, so we're just going to wrap them up into one, but we don't actually know if they're the same. So the biggest evidence for this is how Spamton's relation to Mike is in such a friendly way, which, he's also... Hello, me from the future here. It was at this point in the video that I had to answer my phone. I would have cut this part out, but I wanted to keep my funny ringtone in it because it's a funny ringtone. But I don't know how to actually do that, so I'm just gonna insert this here into the video randomly. Please, I hope you enjoyed this 140p friend gif. Goodbye. So yes, Mike, where even was I? Oh, okay. So, while being very connected to Friend, Spamton is also very connected to Mike. He refers to him, like, as a friend, so that would further Friend's name being Friend. Friend's emphasis on Mike, in the Mike battle is a big thing, too. It's like, yo, why are there so many cats? Why is Pooey, like, objectively image Friend? And there's also the whole Spamton Sweet 6 which very prominently features Friend as like this huge thing, and it's like, okay, well, Friend is connected to Spamton really strongly, and Mike is connected to Spamton really strongly, why not, right? So it's all like we don't have any silver bullet evidence, it's just a bunch of circumstantial stuff. It's like, this feels right. So what does it mean for Friend to have been the one to drive the secret bosses insane? Well, I'm sorry to say, even though we just spent the last forever talking about it doesn't really tell us that much about the future, right? Because if Friend really did drive the secret bosses insane, it doesn't really mean much for Friend, right? It's pretty cool, but it just mostly reaffirms Friend being Gaster's tool, which is already the evidence is that Friend is Gaster's tool, so it doesn't really tell us anything. So it would be cool, and I do think that would be sick if Friend drove the secret bosses insane, like, on Gaster's volition. But does that, like, actually mean anything? Yes. It means that Mike is probably Friend, and Mike being Friend is a big thing, right? If Friend was Mike, that means Friend has an actual presence in the story, like, he appears in the main story, he interacts with Darkners, he's even met some of the main bosses, like Tina, right? It gives us a nice segue into Friend stuff if we finally figure out who this weird Mike guy is that Tin's been talking about, or Spamton's been talking about. Mike was even brought up in the main story at one point. Maybe this is slowly getting even people who haven't been doing the secret boss route stuff accustomed to the idea of Friend being a character, of Mike being a character, right? In the same chapter as Mike is really formally introduced to the majority of the player base, Friend appears in like the first 5 minutes. So we've been going on and on and on about what Friend is, and all of this about the grand Gaster plan and Mike. But we've kind of been ignoring Noelle, which is kind of crazy because we had like a whole second section of the video, like a third of the video is about Kris, which is, Nightmare's person, and none of this has been about Noelle. But basically, to recap what Noelle's deal with all this is, Noelle, demon, is Friend, right? He stepped into the dark and met Gaster to do all of its scheme and became the pointed tail and whatever. But whilst doing all this Friend Gastery stuff, Friend was still Noelle's demon. They appeared in cat headers to only Noelle, taking on a cat form due to Noelle's connection to the game, probably. And this leads us to a good question. Hey, what did Friend even do to Noelle, really? So, I think that Friend, being like this video game secret to Noelle, is like a big part of it, right? Because Friend is this video game secret, Noelle loves to find video game secrets, so they hide in the back of her favorite games to bring her fear, because it's like super creepy, right? There's this weird demon cat thing in the back of all your favorite games, right? That brings her fear, but since Noelle also loves fear, and since Friend feeds on her fear, it's this weird like cyclical loop that gains Friend more power the more Noelle is afraid, right? And I think there's a bit more to this, right? Because Friend only first appears in Chapter 2, which is when Noelle is really lost in the dark, when she's first really introduced to dark worlds. And they appear in an area that mimics the types of things that used to scare Noelle, right? She talks about how she used to be like super afraid of the plug faces, or of plugs, because she thought they were smiling at her. There's a plug in that basement where Friend first appears that has a plug smiling at her. And, it only appears it's only after Chapter 2, after Noelle first enters the Dark World, that Friend appears in abundance. It really becomes part of the story, something that you can actually see. And I believe, this is like a pretty unfounded theory, but it would be kind of cool, is that Noelle will show up in the Chapter 5 Dark World, and this is what's going to lead to Friend becoming powerful enough to be the Field with Pink and Gold secret boss. So, after 47 minutes of recording this video, we're almost finished. But before we wrap it up, that was quite a lot. I've been getting through this pretty quickly, but this is still a lot of stuff. So, here's a bit of a recap. ERAM, Nightmare, and Friend are Darkners like the Titans, made up of the shadow of the backside of your individual mind, whereas the Titans are the collective shadow of their mind. They are your personal nightmare. Nightmare, the real name of ERAM, is Kris's personal, nightmare. They make Kris remember their trauma, the trauma that they had in the shelter. Thank you for the typo, me. They make Kris remember that they are a vessel, and they make Kris remember their past guilt and their past shame. And, the Forgotten Man is also another vessel that Kris in the past attacked due to Kris wanting so bad to forget that they were truly a vessel. But in the end, Kris never could wash it all away. And for Friend is the demon formed long, long ago from Noelle, who seeped into the dark and met the good Dr. Wingding's Gaster, becoming his partner, device, and his friend. Friend was Gaster's device that he used to interfere with the story, to keep his eyes on it all, that he used to watch with from the dark. And it was Friend who drove the secret bosses insane, giving them the shadow crystals, and they might even be Mike. Friend then became the prophecy's tale of hell for Gaster, and he led the poor children to the bunker, all whilst tormenting Noelle from the back of the code of her favorite games, harnessing her fear and becoming more fully realized as she spends more and more time in the darker yet darker world. And that's it. That's Deltarune Nightmare Theory. Yeah, if you've made it this far, it really doesn't feel like I've been talking that long, but this recording is like 50 minutes long by now, so thanks for sticking around to the end. It means a lot to me, yada yada, all that cheesy nonsense, but in all seriousness though, it does really mean a lot to have people stick around and see this cool thing that I made. So, oh, another thing too, my previous video, which I thought was going to get like 80-something views, because my theory video before that, which I can see why it didn't get as many views, got like 80 views. Mostly because the thumbnail for my last video was good, and the thumbnail for my first video was, not. But my point is, my second video got like 3,000 views, and I think I had a bit of a stroke seeing that, so thanks a lot for the support on the last video. If you enjoy this one, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more Hyperlink Locked, because I will try my best to respond to all the comments if I can think of a response that isn't like, yeah, that's cool, or no, you're wrong, which sometimes, granted, I can't. So sorry for the guy that put in my last video, I had a theory, but I guess it may be wrong, ... thinking emoji. There is a 99% chance you're a bot, so I'm not responding to that one. In any case, that's it. Thanks you all for watching, and I'll see you guys, what am I gonna make next? Probably my video on what I think the prophecy's true ending was, and how that relates to, the entirety of Deltarune, what the big themes are. And that's it. I'll see you guys then.